You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History of Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole.
Naturally, we had to do an episode about a film that we basically manifested into existence. We have been talking about wanting a film about the fascinating life of Joseph Bologne, or Chevalier, since we covered Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette, and here we are.
And here it finally is. We truly have been waiting on this.
Right?
For what feels like forever. But for those of you who might not know, Chevalier is a biopic historical drama. It's not one of those like cradle to grave biopics, and I think it's better for it. But it is directed by Stephen Williams. It is written by Stefani Robinson, and it's based on the life of Joseph Bologne, or as he's better known, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Kelvin Harrison Jr. plays the titular role. It also has Samara Weaving, Lucy Boynton playing Marie Antoinette, and Minnie Driver, which for me and Maggie, who are both
Phantom girlies,
big fan of the opera girlies, it was very exciting to see Minnie Driver playing a
Madonna
soprano at an opera again. It premiered at the 2022 Toronto Film Festival on September 11th, 2022, and it has finally been released in the United States on April 21st, 2023. I have been waiting so long.
Honestly, I was so envious that you got to see this one at TIFF because I only just got to see this movie when you and I got to do something very exciting, which we'll talk about later.
Yep.
And I absolutely adored this film.
Yay!
I loved that it wasn't a cradle to grave type film, that it kind of ends on this really high point, low point if you think about what's happening in society, but it leaves you wanting more. And I think that more comes in the form of being like, oh, like this is a real person. Like there's more history I can, learn about this person, more stories I can like absorb about who he was and his history and his life and like the importance of his life. And that's the kind of historical films that I really love, especially with biopics like this. I love wanting to learn more, which is probably why I like history. But honestly, like I found very little that I didn't like about this film. Like I can't even think like right now off the top of my head which things, like maybe I wanted to be longer, maybe I want it more played into like the relationship, little things like that. But like overall I thought this was a really tight, really well crafted film from start to finish, and Kelvin is just phenomenal. I loved him so much in Cyrano, and I remember being so excited when his casting was announced for this film, and then like seeing the first pictures, the first trailers. Like he's just so good, and I really want to see him in more of these like romantic musical like films. Like it just feels like that's his vibe, but I also don't want him to be typecast in the same kind of role. But like I adore him so much.
Same. Like you said, I saw this back in September, TIFF at its premiere. I was immediately so enchanted by this film, and not just because Lucy Boynton was sitting a few rows ahead of me, which also was pretty thrilling though. And I have been waiting for you to see it ever since then. And I will admit, because of the fact that it's been like 7 months in between me seeing it and it coming out, there was a part of me that was like, have I been overhyping this? Like, is Maggie going to be like, this is the movie that you were, like, I can't wait for you to see it about. But I'm very happy that you liked it too. And really, in so many ways, this is exactly the movie that I wanted. When you're working with a topic like Joseph Bologne, who has been so sort of written out of the narrative and dealing with some archival silences, it is so cool to be able to sort of use some creativity, some imagination, and still be able to fold in the historical details that we have. Like one thing that I really admire about the way that they did this movie is that it definitely feels like there's no huge departure from what we know about him in terms of like, deciding to go against something that we know. It's more a case of deciding to invent other things to add in, which I really like, because I think that is one way that like you can really work well with silences. And honestly, in some ways, to me, this movie feels almost in line with like critical fabulation theory and this whole idea of just like hypothesizing to come up with the things that we don't know, which is so common, especially in, African American history that deals with, the transatlantic slave trade and things like that. I think that the romance and the personal drama and all of it is so engaging. But then I really love the plotline towards the end of Chevalier sort of reconnecting with his Caribbean heritage and sort of getting more in touch with the politics of the time. And I'm really glad that even though that's not sort of the main focus of the film, they included that in it, because one of the things that's so crazy about this guy, which I'll talk more about later, is that, he's best remembered today perhaps as a musician and a composer. But he's this incredibly multifaceted individual. He comes to fame through his fencing. He's like a fencing prodigy. He's an incredible athlete overall. And then he ends up very involved in the French Revolution. So, like, I like that they did address a lot of different sort of parts of him and his personality and everything. I think that Kelvin Harrison Jr. is excellent in this role. I know he was already a musician before this, but seeing him able to do all of the sort of violin work and everything for the role is so impressive. I love, 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 love Lucy Boynton's portrayal of Marie Antoinette. Honestly, iconic, genius, beautiful, never been done before. Like, no disrespect to Miss Dunst. I also still love Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette film, but I do think that the side of Marie Antoinette that we get to see Lucy Boynton give us is a really interesting one. I think she does a really good job with the character of helping, alongside the writing, which is also, I think, really good in this movie, but helping portray a Marie Antoinette who is very flawed, but not a villain. And I think that that is sort of a side of her that we don't get to see very often, because I think media around Marie Antoinette either sort of treats her often like this like saintly figure, or it treats her as this like horrible seductress villain woman who's cheating on her husband, questionably incest, sort of like version that they painted of her during the revolution. And so it's really nice to see a portrayal of her that sort of does, I think, walk more of an in-between and is probably thus more realistic, because most humans are not, evil or perfect. I also love the costumes in this movie. I love the hair and makeup in this movie. I think they do a really excellent job with sort of showing, also particularly with moving towards the end of the film, like different classes in Paris in this time, and showing sort of the extreme sort of dichotomy between what the upper classes are looking like and dressing like and what most of the people of France are. And it's also just, I think, really exciting. Like, I think that they do a really good job with Kelvin Harrison Jr.'s costumes and hair and makeup in particular, which is something that you don't get to see many period dramas where you have Black men in this kind of costuming, which is so exciting, and they look great on him. So I just, truly everything about this movie makes me so happy, and it's going to be like, now that it's actually out and people can see it, it's my personal mission to make sure that it does really well, because I think that, like, it's very important for a film like this to do well, because this is how we get more biopics that aren't of just, Winston Churchill and Abraham Lincoln and, as much as I liked it, Elvis. And we get ones that I think are actually more doing what like a biopic should do, which is shed light on a figure from history who has been ignored for whatever reason and get people interested in them.
Yeah, I agree. I mentioned it a little bit in my own review that I wrote. I am to an extent kind of tired of biopics that focus on highly publicized, well-known, prominent figures. Like,
Yep.
yeah, that's great. Like, it is fun to see their lives brought on screen, but you could go to any bookstore, any Wikipedia page and learn all of that same information. Whereas with a topic like this, it is a lot harder to like have that instant gratification of learning more about them. Like, it takes a lot of work to research, and there's a lot of thought put into it, and I appreciate those kinds of biopics so much more.
Yep.
When it's clear that there is a passion behind it and a purpose for bringing that story to the forefront. And in researching for today's episode, I was running into a lot of these like dead ends in this area of research. And I don't, and I think it's really interesting that, I mean, I get from like the producing marketing side of studios why they go for the Bohemian Rhapsodies, the Elvises, the Rocketmen, you know, those kind of films, because they do have that star power of the name, the gravitas of like the musicians. You know, it's easy to make that comparison because this is, you know, another, you know, film about a musician.
Yeah.
But this is like just so much more my speed, and also what I hope that more biopics appear to be.
I agree. And I think that, you know, if you think about, this wasn't a biopic in like a traditional sense because it was sort of a composite of characters, but The Woman King is a great example of something that is sort of one of these untold stories that's not super saturated in the media already, but did bank at the box office. Like that film did better than anyone expected it to. And I think part of it was that they did have a cast with like Viola Davis and John Boyega and these names that people already knew, and some up and coming people like Lashana Lynch, and but names and faces that are recognizable to people, and also like it's a damn good movie, so word of mouth was obviously great on it. And I would love to see I mean, I know that like Chevalier is not going to do that kind of box office because it's not like a big historical epic, but I'd love to see this sort of get that kind of word of mouth campaign and get people going to see it. And I think that it's so important that we have things like that are successful, and that, you know, I also think this one it's so important that this was written, you know, by a woman of color. Like, and it just, everything about this film and its existence like makes me so happy. It's the kind of thing that I'm like, you know, I see this film getting made much like The Woman King last year. And I'm like, yeah, thank God. Like, these are the kind of films that should be getting financed.
Yeah.
And it makes me happy. Not that, and you know, like I'm a franchise girly. I love a good franchise film. But I want to see that balance. And I think this is like such a great example of what I want to see, especially as a historian, like what I want to see in the sort of biopic historical drama genre.
And, you know, I think another important aspect of this film is the fact that, yes, there are tragic things that happen in his life, because life is a tragedy, especially in this period of history that was so tumultuous, but it doesn't veer into the trauma porn at all.
Yeah.
Like, it isn't fully a tragedy. Like, there are sad parts, there are, you know, the truth of that time period for a Black man, but it doesn't leave you feeling super depressed, which I think is like really important when we look at biopics about people who are not white. Like, I feel like so often we have those films that are pure horror.
And, you know, it's something that I've talked a lot about, like in grad school with classmates and stuff, as public historians in particular, with this idea that like it's so important to be interpreting like the history of slavery. But it's equally as important that we don't reduce the history of people of African descent, of Black people in America and abroad, to slavery.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what happens so often in the media with any sort of historical thing, is that you get 12 Years a Slave is a great film. Harriet, I actually think, is a very good movie.
Yeah.
But that shouldn't be all of the historical films that have, you know, Black figures in them. Like, and, you know, obviously we've made some sort of progress with things like Bridgerton and Mr. Malcolm's List, like where you have characters being played by people of color. But it's equally as important to be actually telling genuinely Black and other, you know, people of color stories in ways like this, or again, like The Woman King, I think is a really good example as well. Something that is uplifting and celebratory of these figures and not just trauma porn.
Yeah. Like we need to make films that focus on the joy of life, not just the tragedy of life.
Exactly. And I think this one does like a really great job of walking that very careful line of it being really about celebrating him and his achievements and looking at great things that he accomplished, while also recognizing what he was up against and the fact that he did have issues because of it, but not letting that sort of become the focus of it. Like, if you center oppression, then I feel like in some ways it takes away from what he was achieving. And I think I think that they did, and particularly, you know, Robinson in writing it, did a really fantastic job of
An amazing job.
Yeah, ensuring that the focus is sort of where it needs to be.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
Which, again, we never have easy ways of like segues. Like we find a good segue and then we keep talking because we're like so excited about like the topics that we discuss on this podcast. But, you know, my topic this episode is about interracial relationships in Europe, since, you know, a prominent aspect of this film focuses on the relationship that Joseph has. And something that I found quite fascinating while trying to explore this topic is that it is largely untouched in like the world of historical exploration. And I think in part it might be connected to what we were just discussing. Like while we were talking about that, I was thinking about like so often the way that we frame our approaches into looking at Black history is singularly through the trauma, which is obviously something that you always have to like keep in focus. But like, I think it often leads to like overlooking like the happy points. And so it was so interesting, like going through like JSTOR and trying to find, you know, academic articles. So much of them focused on the slavery aspect, the aspect of, you know, white men doing horrible things to the women that they enslaved. And so that was a lot of the focus of like the articles about interracial relationships and like children and like this period of history. And I only found, after doing like 6 hours of research, I only found one like really thorough, really well written academic work, which was written by Duane C. Pruitt, who wrote God's Black First Fruits, Creating Community Among 18th Century Nantes Jeunesse de Couleur. I can't speak French, but that is free people of color. Free people of color is what that means. And he wrote it from Morgan State University. And his research only focused on one city of Nantes in France. It was not a like larger scale research, but he was able to look into the records in 18th century France in this one city. And he looked through the parish records and he found 6 marriages involving free people of color. And only 2 of those relationships were between a Black man and a white woman. So a very small like collection here. And like, obviously there is the possibility that they were not reported and recorded the way that other relationships may have been, or they just weren't as common, or they weren't getting married. Like there's so many different factors into this. And again, this is just like one city. And I wanted to highlight that just simply because there is so little on this topic, and that really confounded me and made me a little sad that I'm not still in the historical field, because I definitely could have like gone down a really deep rabbit hole. But also I can't speak French, and there was a lot of things that were in French. So there is definitely...
Okay, that's one of the things about European history is that like so much of the French just doesn't get translated because there's this like weird assumption in the like 80s and 90s that like if you were doing European history, you must speak French. It's so weird.
It's so weird. Because it's like I've gone down rabbit holes about like German history, and all of it's translated. But then when I try to go down a rabbit hole about France, it's like, no, actually.
Yeah, literally sometimes you'll be reading an article that's in English and it'll be like, here's a block quote in French. Like,
and no translation.
No translation. Yeah.
It drives me crazy. There was definitely some stuff like, while Pruitt did a really great job with this, there was definitely phrases in French that then there was no footnotes to match. Like there was footnotes for a lot of other like really great information. And it's so funny because this historiography that he did has so much in the footnotes that was what I was looking for that didn't make it into like the actual body of the article. So I was like really glad that I know to read the footnotes. But it was just really interesting, like the fact that there's so little studied about this topic, and all I could find was one singular 13-page paper that only focused on one town, which I think also, like going back to what you said, like if you are researching this topic and you don't speak French fluently, and a lot of these documents are locked behind like not being translated and not being like easily accessible, like it is going to be a lot harder to research, especially going back to the 18th century. That's quite a while ago. And, this period of history is really interesting because there was other stuff that he elaborated on within this. Like he found in 1729 an instance of 30-year-old Anne Chaplet, a white woman who gave birth to the child of an enslaved man named Pierre. Births like these appear to be very rare or rarely recorded. So these are people who are most likely in relationships that were never able to actually get married, which makes sense because like there was some weird laws in this period of time. Well, they weren't technically laws. And this is, again, I don't know French stuff. That's not a period of like European history that ever really like intrigued me. So there were acts that forbade interracial marriage, but they weren't laws. So people could do it. It was just suggested that they didn't do it. But then there were some people like, no, well, an act's really a law. But then people were still doing it, and there kept being these acts. I found like 5 or 6 different instances of these acts in the early like 1720s into like the 1740s. But they weren't laws. And like some people could bend the rules. It's very confusing. It's not at all like, I obviously know a lot about like English laws, colonial laws, these kind of things. And then there were specific acts that the French were ruling in their colonies. And you could obviously kind of read into why they were trying to make these laws in their colonies, considering like the areas they were colonizing. It all makes sense when you like really pick at it. But there obviously were these people who were getting married, that they were having children, that they were having lives. So then in 1778, under King Louis XVI, an act was signed which forbade, and I quote, this is what it says, whites of either sex to contact marriage with blacks, mulattoes, or other people of color. So this was kind of like the bigger one. This was the one that most historians seem to think was like more of a law. This also seemed to be in response to like a rising number of free people who were residing in Paris at the time. Like a direct correlation with like the census of that year. So that seemed like, well, the rich white people were worried. And of course, like this didn't really forbid marriage, not so much relationships. So like there were still children being born. It was a mess. And again, this is like more of an administrative law rather than like an actual law. Again, very confusing. The way that I felt like I needed to suddenly become a lawyer to understand some of the verbiage and what they were like implying with the stuff, it was very confusing. And while these weren't laws, when it came to heritage and nobility, nobles needed a king's authorization for their marriages, which I thought was interesting. And then, of course, in like 1792, in September of 1792, all of the restrictions regarding interracial marriage were repealed under revolutionary government. However, it was pretty short-lived because under Napoleon's government, once again, they forbid marriage between Black and white couples. Specifically, their rule did not mention anybody else. And then there was a lot of back and forth laws and restrictions throughout the rest of the 19th century. And I did want to note that in Pruitt's research, he did also find one instance in Nantes of a Black man and a woman of Indian descent getting married. Because I think so often when we talk about interracial marriages, we only specifically highlight like Black and white relationships rather than like there's a whole lot of other people out there in the world. And I thought it was interesting that he highlighted that, and it made me happy. And it made me wish that there was more research out there about what was happening in France in this period of time. But again, like this is just like a weird, dark period of this history. This is the dark ages of this topic.
Yeah.
In history.
Yeah. It is interesting too, because I do think it goes to show that, while obviously France has had and continues to have its own issues with racism and stuff, most of Europe, to my knowledge, was not as sort of obsessive about putting laws on the books about what non-white people could and could not do as the United States was in this time period. And part of that is, I'm sure, because, you don't have plantations in France. Like,
yeah,
most slave owners, their enslaved people are like in the, West Indies. They're not in France. So that makes it a little less important in their eyes to like ensure the division between races. But
yeah. And that's why it was so interesting that like there was a correlation between like the rise in the census and then of course like a lot of their laws being meant for their colonies rather than actual France. Very interesting. Very racist.
Very well. You hate to see it, but Obviously, I wanted to talk a bit about biography of Chevalier himself. I went a little overboard with this. I'm so sorry, but like, hang in there. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of the scholarship about Joseph Bologna was only available in French until like the late 1990s and early 2000s, which I think is part of like why we don't know more about him, is because like people in England were not writing about him, or in England and the United States weren't writing about him. Even in France, there wasn't like a ton of stuff going on sort of in between his lifetime and the like 1980s. And then he sort of gets rediscovered. But Joseph de Bologna was the son of Georges de Bologne de Saint-Georges, a wealthy Frenchman who was living in the colony of Guadeloupe. Guadeloupe? I don't know. It's the names. It's not even the French names that are stumping me tonight. But in the French West Indies at the time of Joseph's conception. Now, Georges de Bologne was married to a woman named Elizabeth in 1739, and the following year they moved to this 250-acre plantation where they had 60 enslaved people. And amongst these enslaved people was a woman named Anne, but called Nanon, who was about 17 years old at the time that she met Georges de Bologne. And she had been born there in Guadeloupe to parents of African origin. I believe it's thought that she was of Senegalese like origin, but don't think we know like for certain. But in any case, somehow Nanon and George end up in a relationship of some sort. It does seem, unlike a lot of the time that you have, these children born of an enslaver and a enslaved person, it does seem that there's at least some sort of positive relationship between them, considering the way that Joseph is treated after he's born. So he's born on Christmas Day on, let's see, in 1745. And because he is, half African, half Black, he's not eligible to inherit his father's titles. But immediately, Georges de Bologne does give him his last name. He gives him, a full, sort of public acceptance as his father, which is quite unique in this time period and in this place. And one of the sort of mysteries about Joseph de Bologne's early life is that several historians have pointed out that we kind of have a sketchy understanding of what the family dynamic in this household was, because, Georges de Bologne and his wife stay together, but they raise Joseph quite closely to them and pay for him to go to good schools. He travels with Elizabeth, who's, his father's wife. But they also like keep Nanon quite involved with him. And at one point when he's in school, I'll talk about later, they sent her to visit him for several weeks, like from the West Indies. So it's very sort of confusing, more so that I think than most of the time where you have this sort of dynamic where they're, obviously children being born to enslaved women who had white fathers was very common. But it's very uncommon that you have a father who like really embraces the child as his son in the way that Georges de Bologne did. But in December of 1747, Georges de Bologne kills a man in a duel. He fatally wounds him, and he has to flee the colony and go back to France. And he, gets the heck out of Dodge, essentially. And in his absence, he is sentenced to death and his goods are seized. But uniquely, they do allow his wife to leave for France with Joseph and Nanon with her. So, Joseph, his mother, and his father's wife head to France. And while they're there, he arrives, he's 3 years old. He turns 3 while on the ship, and he arrives in France for the first time on January 4th of 1749. While they're in France, King Louis XV grants George a pardon, so they're able to return back to their plantation. We know that Georges gives Joseph lessons in music and fencing while he's growing up. He's definitely not living the normal life of an enslaved child. And from what I can tell, there's never sort of any question that he is free, even though law at the time does state that sort of your status as a free person or an enslaved person is dependent upon your mother's status. So by all accounts, he should be considered enslaved, but there's never even any sort of like emancipation that we see of him. And I couldn't find anything specifically, but we do know that by the time that she dies, Nanon is a free woman. So at some point in all of this, it's unclear when though, the Bolognas certainly emancipate Nanon, and Joseph, it's possible, I guess, maybe it was happened before Joseph was born, so that he was born free. It's possible that there's sort of some provision emancipating him later in his life. That's one of the details that I wasn't at least able to find in my research available anywhere. But in any case, at the age of 8, Joseph de Bologna goes with his... I keep like trying to put a phrase to what Elizabeth is to him. There's no word in the English language that describes that relation. But he goes with his father's wife to France, to Bordeaux, to start school. And Nanon actually was sent there like the following year to visit him for several weeks. And they, paid for her to go visit him. So from all of this, you really can see that Joseph de Bologna has all of these advantages given to him in his childhood. And that's part of, it's not sort of that bootstraps narrative that people like to use anytime there sort of is a person of color who's able to reach success in a society that is designed to not allow them to. It definitely is because he was given certain privileges that then he took all the opportunities that were handed to him. But in 1755, Georges and Nanon arrive in France. They take Joseph to live in Paris with them in the Saint-Germain quarter. And a couple of years later, George is made a gentleman of the king's chamber, which essentially means he's a personal assistant to King Louis XV. In 1756, Joseph is enrolled at the fencing academy of Nicolas Texier de la Bussière, I think is how you say it. I could be saying that wrong. But it's essentially this elite boarding school reserved for the sons of nobility, but Joseph de Bologna is allowed to enroll. He becomes quite close friends with the son of the school's headmaster, and he studies mostly fencing. They spend about half their days studying fencing, and then math, history, languages, music, drawing, dance, all the things that a gentleman in France is supposed to know. Now, we know that in 1763, he purchases the title of écuyer, or Chevalier, which essentially is an office of the public ministry, who's supposed to carry the king's orders to the war tribunal. Like most sort of positions in the court in France at the time, it is largely an ornamental role to give one status. Normally, men had to be 25 to be allowed to take on this role. He's only 17. He gets the age limit waived for him. In 1764, he becomes an officer of the King's Guard. He is not technically allowed to hold the title of Chevalier due to not being fully white, due to having this, mixed race heritage, but he uses it anyways, and everyone refers to him as it. So I guess people kind of decide that they don't care. And it's interesting because you do see, though, like 2 years before that, in 1762, there's a decree that all Blacks and people of color is the like literal translation of the French phrasing, had to register with the clerk of the Admiralty. Nanon, we know, goes and registers herself. The headmaster of the school registers Joseph for him, alongside 157 other people in Paris. So obviously it's not a huge number, but it is that thing of, I feel like whenever we talk about period dramas, a lot, people are like, well, there were only white people in France at this time. And it's like, obviously anytime that people want you to come register for some reason like that, it's not a good sign, but it's helpful to us as historians to be able to be like, no, we know in this year in France, there's at least 150 people of color. So, and, like you were saying, France has really weird sort of laws around race at this time period. It had a code noir since the 17th century, which is essentially like, that weird amalgamation of acts and things, but it's not super official. There are also people like Voltaire in the country at the time, who Voltaire is incredibly racist. He believes that Black people are inherently inferior. And there's actually like stuff written at the time basically being like, Voltaire clearly has not accounted for Chevalier. Like, people even at the time are being like, okay, yeah, if that's true, then how him? Voltaire basically at one point says, like, well, like, he's a very talented musician, but I don't think he's a good composer because, like, he's not able to be creative. Like, that's not something that he's capable of because he's Black, which is dumb. Like, it's one of those things where it's like, you know, Voltaire very clearly got caught in his own mistake. In any case, there is a presence of Black people in France at the time, even though it's small. There's a very small presence of Black people in the French upper class. There are a handful of other people, but Chevalier is definitely sort of the most prominent person. And Georges de Bologne makes his will in December of 1765. And in it, he leaves Nanon 3,000 pounds, and he does refer to her as a free Negro woman. So we know that at least by that point, she is already no longer enslaved. He leaves his son, and refers to him as his son, 50,000 pounds, which, you know, is a very hefty sum in the late 1700s in France. So he's providing for him well, leaving him a good portion of his money. So by 19, when Joseph is leaving the fencing academy, at this point, he is known to everyone in town. He's known to people in Paris as Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges. And he goes by that name from here on out until the Revolution. He's very well known in Paris already at the age of 19 for his fencing talent. He's known as like an all-around great athlete. There's stuff about how like he's a really talented runner. He's a great dancer. And he also is very gifted at music. He played the harpsichord and the violin, and in the 1760s, we know that he is beginning to work, you know, in orchestras and sort of take part in the musical world. He has several pieces dedicated to him by other composers. But his first musical compositions that we still have, at least, or that we know of, are from 1770. He's actually amongst one of the first people in France to be composing string quartets, which is like a weird thing to me because I sort of think of string quartets as being like a staple of, you know, classical music, but that's actually like fairly new at the time. And those were first performed in the Parisian salons in 1772. And now, you know, sort of like what we see in the film, he becomes the conductor of Le Concert des Amateurs in 1773. He produces like 8 violin concertos, 2 symphonies over the following 2 years. He is submitted to be the head of the Paris Opera, which is considered like the most prestigious position for a musician in all of France, maybe in all of Europe if it's a good year for the Paris Opera. And he is refused because 3 or 4 of the head sopranos of the opera get together and they say that they will not be taking orders from a mixed race man. And so it kind of is this big issue. Marie Antoinette had been supporting his bid. And eventually it is actually the king who makes the call that he's not going to get it because they're worried that all their top sopranos are going to quit if they get on the position. Which obviously is a pretty big blow to his career because it means that, like, no matter what else he does, he can never achieve the top position in, you know, the musical society of France. But he becomes music director at the private theater of the Marquise de Montesson, who is married to the king's brother. And he directs musical performance there as well as composing them. In 1779, he begins performing with Marie Antoinette at Versailles. Some people at Versailles don't like this. Marie Antoinette doesn't care. It's one of the perks of being queen, I guess. There is actually this case where he's out walking one night at like 12:30 p.m. with a friend in Paris in the Boulevard du Temple, and he's attacked. And there's like varying ideas about why and by whom. Some people say it's a jealous husband who believes that their child was fathered by him. That is an actual theory about this attack on him. He does survive, thankfully, and isn't injured too badly. But his safety sort of becomes a bigger concern. His career really peaks in the late 1770s, but he does some traveling to England, and it sort of introduces him to the abolition movement. And he founds this group in France called La Société des Amis des Noirs, the Society of the Friends of Black People, to sort of help the people in Paris who are Black and of African descent, and also to sort of get involved in abolitionist thought. And when he's in England, there are a couple of other close scrapes. Clearly, people are not pleased with him and his abolitionist activity. One very interesting fact that I found was that he is one of the first Black Masons. He was initiated into the Lodge of the Grand Orient of France, specifically the Nine Sisters, where he directed an orchestra for a while that was entirely made up of Masons, which is fascinating. Throwback to our National Treasure episode. He had a reputation, as they called him, the Black Don Juan. And he was said to be a player. There's also a lot of stuff like wrapped up in that about the fact that he was supposedly very good looking. And some of that is definitely sort of that whole like racist ideology of like the Black man's like sexual overdrive sort of stuff coming out. He also is considered to be sort of a player, perhaps because of the fact that he like never marries, but that's largely because, as we were saying, there's not sort of these strict laws on the books about interracial marriage, but it's very difficult actually for him to find a partner because of his social class, and because he's above the social class of most of the other Black people in Paris at the time. But because the women, the white women of his social class are so obsessed with sort of the standing and power and how they look to other people, they're not willing to marry him. So he sort of is at an impasse and he never ends up getting married. Now, everything sort of changes when the revolution starts in France. He's living in Lille at the time, and he joins the National Guard and he's made a captain in 1790. And at this time, he starts going just by Saint-Georges or just by Georges, because he doesn't really want people throwing Chevalier around him, because that's a reminder that he is tied to the French nobility. And that is the world in which he sort of grew up and lived in for a long time. He enlists in the army like proper in 1791, and he is actually appointed head of a corps made entirely of men of color, or almost entirely of men of color. It's about 1,000 men, and it's called the Légion Franche de Cavalerie des Américains. It's a lot of people who've come over from America who are willing to fight in the French Revolution. It actually becomes known, though, as the Légion Saint-Georges. A fun fact, also relating back to a former episode of ours, is that his close friend Alexandre Dumas was his lieutenant colonel, and this Alexandre Dumas is the father of the Alexandre Dumas who writes The Three Musketeers. So another callback. Things go well for a little while. The regiment gets renamed. A lot of the men of color are taken out of it and are sent to squash slave rebellions in the colonies. He does play this like really important role, and I'm not going to go into it because it's complicated, but he like stops treason from occurring with another like member of the army in Lille in April of 1793. And so for a while he's like hailed as this hero. He saved a bunch of soldiers with it, whatever. But as the revolution goes on, if you know anything about the French Revolution, it becomes increasingly a witch hunt. And so eventually, basically, his ties to nobility catch up with him. Even Alexandre Dumas turns against him, and they accuse him of wrongdoing, and he's arrested on November 4th of 1793. Now, luckily, he's released in October of 1794. He finally, they're like, we never gave him a trial. We can't actually prove he did anything wrong, and they let him go. Slavery is outlawed in French colonies in February of 1794, so that seems like a pretty good, win. But Napoleon does bring it back when he comes into power. So, it's a short win. In 1795, in December, Nanon passes away. She leaves everything that she still has to her son. It's a really bad time in Chevalier's life. He's just gotten out of prison. His military career has sort of been squashed. His mother's dead. A lot of people believe that he went to Haiti for a while in 1796, but they actually have never been able to find record of him on any ship, either going to or from Haiti. but there are people who like knew him who mentioned that he's in Haiti at the time. Probably true, just unconfirmed. But we know that by 1797, he's back in Paris and he's working with an orchestra again. And he does live out the next couple of years of his life and it works with an orchestra until his death on June 10th of 1799. He's only 53 years old when he dies, and they believe that he had a bladder infection that went untreated and basically just got progressively worse until it killed him, which is kind of a scary thought. A lot of the local papers published obituaries for him, and, you know, it was considered like a big deal whenever he died. Now, from what I could gather, a lot of the issues sort of in the historiography around him are because of this 19th century novel by Roger de Beauvoir that it's one of those, I mean, it's the classic, like, writers in the 1800s being like, I'll just fill in what I don't know with facts that I made up myself. And so there's like a lot of issue in the, you know, next like 100 to 150 years with people not knowing that a lot of that is false. And so basically, I just want to end by saying he's a really fascinating figure. He should not be reduced to this like nickname that he's had of the Black Mozart, because he's so much more than that. I mean, beyond just like the issues of equating him as like the Black version of a white composer, it also honestly is like playing down his achievements, because he's not even just a musician. He's an athlete. He's a public official. He's a soldier. He fights in the French Revolution. Like, but also just we shouldn't like calling anyone like the Black insert other figure here is offensive, and not something that we should still be doing in the year 2023. I also wanted to plug International Music Score Library Project Online has a bunch of like recordings available of his compositions. Some of them are just like computer generated of like, you know, in a program of what it sounds like if you play through his music with all the instruments. But they're for free and you can go listen to them, because I do think it's quite sad that like his compositions at the time were really celebrated, but they've really fallen out of, you know, fashion in terms of he's not one of those like classical composers that you hear all the time. So my plea to the world now is that we not only like revive his importance in history, both in France's history and in music history, but also like revive the playing of his work, because he, from everything, you know, I'm not like an expert in classical music, but from everything I read, he was pretty damn talented. And that's the end of my very long rant.
That was exceptional. That made up for the fact that I have two topics that don't have a lot for me to say in them.
Listen,
you know, with
we're out here talking about archival silences. We're also talking about, like, I don't know if you call the costume thing an archival silence. It will be one day. And I was scouring and scraping, like, bottom of the barrel in places to be able to put together things.
It is a struggle.
Yeah.
It is a struggle.
It fits with the episode theme, so...
You know, it's so funny because I did the other topic like first, because I was like, oh, this is going to take like a lot of time. I'm not going to find any resources. I will just be able to breeze through costumes. And no, I have yet again run into a brick wall with the costumes of the Chevalier. So the stunning costumes, I feel like I should start at the beginning. The stunning costumes of the film were designed by Oliver Garcia, who is a relatively unknown costume designer, at least compared to some of the other costumers that we have highlighted on this podcast. Oliver is best known for his work on Soulmates in 2020 and Tomorrow. He does have about a decade of experience in costumes, working on various films and various aspects of the department. But overall, like these are his first real big projects as costume designer. And I feel like with such a small body of work behind him, like he really pulled off Chevalier with like astounding success. You know, unfortunately, he has not done a lot of press for the film. You know, I went straight to his website to see what he had on there. I even looked at his LinkedIn. So if he sees me, hey, I looked on your LinkedIn. Beautiful pictures that are just stills from the studio. No like information, anything built into that.
If he would like to do an interview, we're here.
We're here. You know, I usually go to like places like Vogue, Vogue UK, Vogue America, like Vogue France, like Elle, the types of, news sources that really like diving into the costumes. I even looked to see if there are any during the festival circuits, like scouring podcasts, and I found nothing, which is really depressing because the costumes of the Chevalier are just gorgeous, and they are. I always say it's really hard to talk about costumes when they're done right. And this film is done exceptionally well. They're historically accurate. The hair was accurate, which I know is another department that's HMU, but still, like, it kind of goes into like the picture that's being crafted. And I always have such qualms about hair in historical films. The hair was very accurate, and which paired always very nicely with the costumes, which are just like exceptionally astounding, very vibrant, and also like this picture of excess, which this period of history is like, if you've seen Marie Antoinette, you understand this like vision of this period of history. And I felt like that was really well played in the costumes of the Chevalier. That's all I can say, because it's done well. It's always difficult to discuss costumes when they're done well.
Absolutely. It's that sort of thing of like, yeah, they did it.
Yeah. Good job. A+. Gold star.
I especially really do love the use of like, this is going to sound funny, but the use of wigs in the movie.
Yes.
And I don't mean like wigging actors to look like their real hair. I mean like putting people in wigs that clearly are wigs, because I think that that's one thing that, especially with men, historical movies often like don't do, because they like want to make sure that they look hot or whatever. And I'm like, first of all, like Kelvin Harrison Jr. still looks hot in a wig. Like, white powder or no, like he's looking good.
And it's historically accurate.
Exactly. And it's so important, I think, to that time, because of the way that like the wigs are one of those things that, beyond just like how elaborate the clothing is and everything, I think it's one of the most obvious markers of social class. And I think it's so important that they use them properly in the film. And yeah, I loved it. And I love also, and I know you'll appreciate this too, like, because there's so much, at the opera and sort of like with performance in this, and seeing like the staging and stuff, like as a former theater kid myself, I was like totally geeking out, because I think that the history of performance, especially, in a country like France, is really interesting, especially in this time. It was as it's really in the period where it's growing out of being the sort of like Christian moral play type thing into just like, it doesn't have to have a moral, you're just telling a story kind of work that, is much more what we have today whenever we think of theater and opera and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, this film is so well designed. It's great in every aspect.
It truly is. I feel like it is like so perfect that this film was made. Obviously it was in the works for a long time before we even had this like thought that somebody needs to tell this story. But like, I just feel like this is another one of those, in the same way that like All Quiet on the Western Front was like perfectly suited for us. This was another one that just really played to like our personal interests and our strengths. And I felt like it's so fun that this is also the episode that we get to unveil our very first interview as Petticoats and Poppies. And it really just could not have been like a better situation for us. While Nicole and I have done a lot of interviews separately, like so many, I think we're probably up into like the hundreds, but between us, this was the first one that we got to do together, which is a fun milestone for not only the podcast, but our friendship. And we had this wonderful opportunity to talk with Stefani Robinson, who is the, of course, screenwriter of the Chevalier. And we got to talk with her about what inspired her to tell this story, how she worked with the information that, is available. Obviously, we talked so much about these like archival silences, this importance for telling a story that wasn't just purely a from cradle to grave tale. And also just like all these other little like beautiful details about what drew her to the story, and like the passion that she clearly has for telling this story. And I think everyone is going to have an exceptionally good time listening to this right now. Hi, well, thank you so much for joining us. We are Petticoats and Poppies, and I'm Maggie, and this is
Nicole.
Hi, how's it going?
Pretty good.
We're so excited to talk to you. I saw this movie back at TIFF, and I absolutely loved it. And I'm so excited for more people to finally get to see it.
Awesome. Thanks for being there.
Yes.
Of course.
So, when you first learned about Joseph's story, how long ago was that, and what kind of went into like filing that story away for this is a script that I want to write?
It was probably about 15 years ago when I first heard about him. I was in high school and I had read like kind of like a little blurb about him. Like it wasn't much, but it was enough to get me really excited about this guy and enough for it to feel like mind blowing. Like how come no one's heard about him? How come we're not talking about this person more? He's incredibly unique and fascinating and should be celebrated. And there was a lot of like anger too around that. Like, oh man, like I'm so mad that like I was in orchestra around the same time, and I was angry that no one like in orchestra had told me about him or even mentioned that, you know, that he was so, I think, influential to the classical music that he at the time. And I think years later, it was just the only movie that I really wanted to make, like, because no one had made it by the time that I was professionally writing in television or anything. And I think the first time someone asked me like, hey, like asked me seriously rather, like, hey, you know, if you were to write a movie, what movie would you want to write? This was the first thing that came to mind. It's like, no one's done this yet, and I'm so angry that that no one knows about this person. But if you guys are enthusiastic too, I'd love to try to tell a story about Joseph Bologne.
That's amazing. We've been talking on our podcast for I think like several years now that someone needed to make this movie. So we were so excited
Yes.
when we finally saw those, you know. And with any biopic, obviously you have to sort of make this very important decision of where you're going to start and end your story with this person. So what led you to the decision to sort of portray this period of Joseph's life? And was it always, you know, your intention to sort of make it a love story? Sort of how did that come about?
It was always my intention to not try to do a cradle to grave like Wikipedia page movie. I think that there now, especially, there weren't at the time, but now I think now especially there's some great resources about Joseph that are historically accurate. I think everyone, if they want all the nitty gritty facts, should just go and read and listen to your podcast. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's talking about him now. Where that information is available. Like, I just wanted the story to feel entertaining. I wanted to feel dramatized. I wanted it to feel operatic. Like, I think that was the thing about his life that excited me when I was young, was that it didn't feel real. Like, it didn't feel historically accurate. Like, it did, like, this guy kind of felt like a superhero or like a myth or like some sort of, I don't know, some sort of tall tale that someone made up, like that he just was sort of larger than life. So to me, I think I just thought it would be interesting, like, you know, he was so involved with opera, and that being sort of like the way that one of the ways you did tell stories at the time was through opera, with, you know, very musical and also very dramatic and melodramatic often at times. I just thought it would be an interesting choice to maybe try to tell his story the same way, because they were so interconnected with the world that he was living in his own life. It just sort of felt operatic. So that was, I think, the mandate for me, is like, how can we use the conventions of opera? And when I say conventions of opera, I mean just like a very clear hero, very clear like star-crossed lovers and tragedy sort of set on the backdrop of war, and very clear villains and opulence and kings and queens and passion and music, and all of those elements, I think, sort of coalesced into what you see now with the movie. So I did a lot of research. There is a lot, I think, of the movie that, even if it's not like quote unquote factual and this thing happened, it is inspired by something that is absolutely true, whether it is in Joseph's life or in his relationships or even just in the time. It's all borrowing. I don't think I invented, or Stephen and I invented anything. And I think all of the inspiration for the artistic liberties we took came from something truthful that was sort of happening around him at the time.
Going off that, I'm curious to know, what was the process like for you in writing the script? Was there a specific scene that you started with, that you built around? Like, what did you visualize as you got started with the script?
The first scene that I wrote is the first scene of the movie. So there's a violin duel at the beginning of the movie, and that to me was sort of like the cornerstone, I think, for the entire movie, just because if you've seen it, there's a silliness to it. There's a cheekiness to it. I think it's a little bit self-aware. It obviously is something that didn't happen, but again, is spiritually sort of true and fun and contemporary, I think, feeling about it. And that to me was, I guess, one of the most important things is capturing that like essence. Again, like, you know, with this idea that I didn't want to write like a biopic. I wanted to write something that felt like an opera and contemporary and fresh and accessible. So that scene, I think, was a great representation of that, and then helped, I guess, tonally shape the rest of the movie.
And, you know, like you said, we know a lot more about this figure now than we used to, but still, what is it like working on a subject about which most people coming to see the film maybe don't know a lot, and there's not as much written about? So, you know, in what ways were those sort of silences in the archives a hindrance, and in what ways was it an opportunity? And is there anything in the film that you think people would be surprised to know is actually based in truth?
I think that's a really good question. I think that you know, whether, like, I don't know, it's like a kind of like an incredible responsibility to introduce this incredible man to everybody. But that's really what it is it's an introduction. I think that's one of the things that Stephen Williams, the director, and I were hopeful that people would leave the audience feeling like they would want to know more, and that they would want to listen to his music more, and that they were curious enough to go not only learn more about Joseph, but maybe be open enough to discovering or rediscovering other people who have been marginalized or forgotten by history for whatever reason. And that said, yeah, I think like sort of these gaps in his life and not being able to really like access the man, right? Because I don't know of any journal entries from him. Like, I don't know of any letters from him that are preserved, and we don't really get his firsthand account or perspective of what it was like to be sort of like the solitary Black man excelling within, you know, the high ranks of the French monarchy at the time. Like, I just don't think we'll ever fully understand what he was going through and how he felt. We can just only infer based on at least Stephen and I and Kelvin's own experiences of what we do feel as Black people in America, but Black people who are, you know, who are working in the creative arts, who strive to do very well and who are committed to doing very well, and how we feel within, I think, predominantly white spaces. Like, we only have our own similar experience to go on to help maybe shade in some of those ideas. So in that way, like, you know, I think the movie became incredibly personal to all of us, that I think that Joseph, in a way, his story in this movie became like a conduit for us to express ourselves. And it was an opportunity, I think, to make it feel a little bit more close to home. And again, it's like that, not such a stodgy, stuffy, like, this happened forever ago and you can't understand this person. And it's, you know, it was a different time and there's nothing to relate to. I think like that gave us an opportunity to get, I guess, become really personally connected to the story. I hope that's what people are also able to take away too when they are introduced to him.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking this time to chat with Petticoats and Poppies.
Of course. Thank you guys. And thank you guys for such a cool, such a cool subject to be talking about.
It's great.
Absolutely.
Thank you for making this movie.
Yeah, thank you.
Wasn't that great?
Yeah. No, truly, like, thank you so much to all of our listeners, because it really is like because of you and people embracing this podcast that we're getting to do these cool opportunities like this. And I hope that this is the first of many. You know, if anyone, if we have any listeners who like work in the industry, even if, you know, you work in costuming or whatever, like, we'd love to talk to you about your work on films. Because I really do feel like I already love this film so much. And I you know, hopefully you agree, Maggie, but I feel like I got such a deeper appreciation of it from
100%.
getting to have that interview. And it felt like it confirmed also so much of what we were already feeling about it. And it what a special first interview to be, you know, to be honestly our first interview. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us in our 49th episode of Petticoats and Poppies.
It is hard to believe that we were almost at 50 episodes.
Yeah, how?
I truly do not understand. But, you know, kind of riffing off what Nicole said, we would love to hear from you on social media. What did you think about our first interview? What did you think about the Chevalier? Are there any other figures in history that, like, you would love to see a movie made about? Because I know we all have our special interests, like figures that we learned about in the footnotes of something somewhere in our, you know, historical exploits.
You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie on Twitter over at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me at Nicole Ackman16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts and on Podchaser and on Spotify. We occasionally read our reviews on air, so be sure to leave us one if you would like to be featured.
We'll be back very soon with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective.
You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
I survived.
I'm so proud of you. You honestly did so well.
Thank you.